Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a senior Power Platform specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation. Power Apps Grid Control. So, we have an agenda for the session. We have a brief introduction. That's what we're doing now. We're going to be covering what the Power Apps Grid Control is, why personally I'm excited by it, and why I think it's actually going to be quite a good control and very useful. We're going to cover how we apply it to our solutions in terms of how we get it, visible within things like model-driven apps. We're going to discuss what the use case is for it. We're going to look at what the capabilities of the control are and what the limitations of the controls are, and then we'll do a bit of a mop-up at the end with some things to note. So that being said, let's launch right into it. What is the Power Apps Grid Control? Okay, this is very simple. For those who have been part of Power Platform for a while, you may know what components are when it comes to things like model-driven apps. But for those that don't, essentially the Power Apps Grid Control is um, it's a component that you can apply to tables that allows you to do a bunch of extra things that you don't have as standard in out-of-the-box Dataverse tables. Components can also be other things, so you can build PCF components for things like SharePoint drag and drop interaction on forms and a few other bits. But essentially, what this is an extension to some degree of an existing control called the subgrid control that allows you to do a lot of extra stuff when you're inside of a model-driven app when it comes to Dataverse data. So, why do I think it's exciting? So, from my personal perspective, there has been many a time where I have wanted to be able to, for instance, edit data inline in a model-driven app view. Kind of like how you have with SharePoint's edit and grid view functionality, or Excel's kind of just edit your rows and data entries freely. But that's been kind of lacking in terms of out-of-the-box support. Well, the reason why this control personally is so exciting for me is because it actually has a very quick and easy way to enable that functionality without you having to develop the functionality yourself. So, given that it's given us the ability to do that, what's the use case for this control? I think it's worthwhile discussing the use case for this control to start with before we see it to understand actually where we might use it. So personally, I find the biggest use case for this at the moment is when you want to give admin users the ability to mass edit data inside a model-driven app without them having to go into each item and edit it via the form that's there. We all know it's quite a laborious process when you have to go into a form, edit a bit of data, come back out, click on the next entry, go into the form, edit the data, so on and so forth, back and forth. And it's, you know, the ability for this control to be able to just be in the main view, have everything listed like a table, and just edit in line is really, really useful. So I've discussed obviously one of the capabilities there, but actually we do have a few other capabilities. So the top one for me is the inline editing. That means that when we put the control on a table and we look at that table in a view, we can edit in the actual view screen of a model-driven app rather than in the kind of in the form itself. So we can edit items. We have the option to show child items. Now I know this was a feature in the subgrid control already, but we don't just show child items because we've got inline editing for the actual control. You can then inline edit child items as well. So if you've got for instance in an asset database a supplier and you want to edit all the items that sit beneath that supplier, you can do that with this control, and you can do it without ever having to navigate in any of the forms. Obviously, we've got the common things in there around filtering, grouping, and sorting that is present for the subgrid control. But one of the big things that's been added in specifically this control, and I'll caveat this with it's currently in preview, is something called column reordering, which means we can drag and drop the order of the columns and how we see them kind of in the control itself. And then the other thing is we have the ability to multi-select items and range select items and turn that on and off with this control as well, which is really cool. It has some good capabilities there, and a lot of these are geared towards kind of mass data editing. So we've looked at obviously why it's exciting, the use case and its capabilities. But how do we actually apply it to our solutions? Well, currently there is only one way to kind of apply it to a solution. So what I've got here, I'm going to walk you through essentially how we would apply it to a demo solution. So I've got a solution here for the demo called Power Apps Grid Control Demo. It's based upon a very simple asset database. So we have a table of assets and a table of suppliers. And these are linked via a one-to-many relationship between suppliers to assets. We also have a users table here because we're going to be assigning asset owners to these assets. Now, when we look at this, this has helped build a model-driven app, which is just here. And if I hit play on this, so we're now in the application, obviously Copilot's there. So you can see here I've got suppliers. This is what the standard view looks like. We can't edit anything. We can't do anything. We can select a record. We can select multiple records. That's fine. But for us to be able to edit these entries, we have to click in and then we have to edit them here, right? Now, these are all the assets that are listed against this supplier. This is the standard subgrid control, what it looks like. Again, I can click in, but I can't edit it. For me to then be able to edit that child item for this supplier, I have to click on to the actual thing, edit it in the form, go back, and then it's a pain, right? It's difficult to do. You have to keep navigating through things to get it to work and edit items. Now, when we look at the assets table on its own, you can see here, same situation. I can't edit anything in line. Let's say I wanted to mass assign assets to people, bits like that, or I wanted to, mass update entries. I can't do that here. Again, I have to keep clicking into the forms, clicking out of them, here, there, and everywhere. It's laborious when we're doing mass data edit. So we want to apply the Power Apps Grid control to make that easier. So how do we do that? It's relatively easy for those who have done kind of component work before, but for those that haven't, you have to apply this component using the kind of classic experience and the view there. So we have the little cog icon up in the top right. We click on that. We go to advanced settings. Then over here at the top, we go from settings into customizations. We choose customize the system. And then underneath entities, we find the table that we want to apply the control to. So ours is listed under PAG-C. We're going to apply it to the assets table. So let's see if I can remember my alphabet. PAG-C assets. So we find the table that we want to add it to. We select it. We hit controls. And what we'll see here is the standard read-only grid. The default one is the one we've seen us interacting with. We hit add control. And then we find Power Apps Grid Control here. Hit add on that. And then what we get is the entry here for Power Apps Grid Control. Now, if we want this to be the kind of view for all entries, in terms of the default view, we have web, phone, and tablet. Now, I want that Power Apps Grid Control to be the default for whatever method the user is using to access the application, right? So I'm going to change the Power Apps Grid Control to be web, phone, and tablet default. Now, when we look at this, you'll see here that we now have a load of properties that sit beneath the Power Apps Grid Control. And this is where we can control those capabilities that I was talking about earlier. So let's say for PAG-C assets, I've got a lookup column to another table. I can hit add lookup on that, and actually I want to see who the assets assigned to as part of it, right? So I'd hit that drop down. I choose who the assets assigned to, and we hope that it picks it up. Handy. See, this is the joys of live demonstrations. We end up with the occasional issue whereby things stop working. Let's give that another try. So when we look at this, we hit, obviously, like I said, hit add a lookup and hit asset assigned to. And you can see there, we can configure what view it uses. So the other thing as well is you've got things like enable editing. So this is what allows us to do that inline editing that I was talking about. So all we do, we can change that to yes, and there we go. That's now going to have inline editing. But what if I don't want the users to be able to edit the child items? Well, there's an option for that, disable editing in child items grid. So if it's showing items that this item is related to in the child items, we can make it so that yes, you can edit the parent item, but no, I'm not letting you edit any of the child items from that grid. But we can turn that to yes as well, and it'd work. We have the option to enable or disable the user being able to filter things, sort things, group them together. Now, some of these are off by default, but we can set them to yes. And then we've got this one here, allow column reordering, preview. So we can choose whether users are allowed to reorder the columns that they're seeing or not. I'm going to hit yes for now. Again, stating that this is a preview feature. It may not be permanently supported, but there are also a number of other kind of behaviors in there. We do have this customizer control property in there. This means that you can customize the control with your own code if you want to do that. But once we have the control configured, we hit save up here. And as you can see, it then updates everything. And then once that's saved, we make sure we hit publish. So that's all well and good. That's been applied to the PagC assets table. Okay, so now that we've applied that, we can close down our classic view here. And then we can go back into our model-driven app. Just give it a quick refresh. Now, it looks like nothing has changed. What should have happened is I should be able to, perhaps grid control. So you can see here, there is a button that's up here on the top. We have just here the option to hit a drop down. And then we also have the option to change kind of the title as well. And change who the asset's assigned to. So as you can see, I've now got the option to inline edit here. Okay, what that means is I can actually then do mass data editing from this. So I can just quickly flick through, assign the assets to lots of people, and make sure it's nice and easy. So that is essentially the Power Apps grid control, how we apply it, what features it's got, what it's capable of. But there are some limitations to it. Okay, now these limitations are, personally, I feel are quite significant, hence why we're talking about them. So one of the major limitations, if I were to show you my assets table that I've got here, I have a business rule on this table. Now it's a basic business rule, and what it does is it shows and hides the field visibility and whether the field is required or not. Now I have a field called asset assigned, which basically tracks the date for when an asset was assigned. Now this business rule checks whether the asset assigned to field that we saw in our app, this one here, is filled or not. And if it is, I want you to make it so that the asset assigned date and time field, which tracks what date and time that asset was assigned to the individual, I want you to make that visible, and I want to then make that field required. Now, if we're inline editing and I assign an asset, we would hope that the business rule would trigger and I'd see a column turn up calling asset assigned, and that it would make that column required. But it hasn't done that. So it's worthwhile noting that the Power Apps grid control doesn't actually respect the business rules that are applied to the entity, so the table. So you can see here, up here, I've got the scope set as entity. Normally that would impact every form, every interaction, but it doesn't work with the Power Apps grid control. So if I click on the PagC assets now, you'll see that asset assigned is a required field. I didn't add that in. It's done it itself, and it's input a date that is not accurate. Okay, so again, big limitation on this. If you have a table that has a business rule that deals with field visibility or kind of business requirement data based on conditionals, the Power Apps Grid Controller is not going to work for that. Okay, so when we look at this, limitations. Here's the other thing. Most of the code controls can be imported into a Canvas app. The Power Apps Grid Control cannot be imported into a Canvas app. Okay, I've tried, it fails every time. I've checked every setting, it just doesn't work. Second limitation, you have to add it via the Classic Editor. Not many people like going into the Classic Editor, but that's the way to do it. And the biggest drawback, like I've just shown, is that it doesn't respect the business rules that have been applied to the entity. It becomes problematic. So he's asked a very good question there. So why can't it be added to the Canvas apps, and is it a future feature? That's unknown at the moment. This is a fresh drop. I would like to see someday from Microsoft that we be able to do that, because I feel like the Power Apps Grid Control would be a really useful control in Canvas apps that we could apply kind of similar to a gallery. You could recreate this feature using a gallery and a load of controls, but something coming pre-built would probably work a lot better. And in terms of the business rules, I really do hope that that comes through. The problem we would end up having with it would be that we'd essentially um, we'd end up in a situation whereby we have people applying these controls to tables and not checking the business rules there. I think it should be made really clear that that's the case. So that's limitations. I know it's obviously normally it's a very short session, but we do open it up for questions and answers shortly. So, final tips and takeaways. The control can be really effective for mass data edit, like an Excel sheet kind of experience in model driven apps. It can be really good for if you're having to do a large amount of data input very quickly. Um, Obviously, please do remember it has to be added via the classic editor. And personally, where the control stands at the moment, I would avoid usage on entities, views, and forms that have business rules that configure field requirements or visibility, purely because it doesn't respect the rules of it. Although, saying that, one of the things I do quite like about it, if I come over here to my suppliers table and I click on my suppliers, you'll see here that this is essentially a subgrid control. Now, if I was really good, what I could do is I could come over here, hit advanced settings, go into customizations, go to customize the system, and then come into entities. Now, I mentioned kind of at the start that we have the ability to show child items in there, which is really good, really helpful. Now, we have a parent-child relationship between our suppliers and our assets. So if I come in here and I hit controls and I add control, and I say, hey, I'm going to make this a Power Apps Grid Control. Worthwhile noting as well, just while I'm here, because I've made the mistake a few times, Power Apps Read-Only Grid and Power Apps Grid Control, two entirely different things. The Power Apps Read-Only Grid doesn't have inline editing and is sometimes a bit difficult. Change this over to web, phone, tablet. Add the lookup. Okay, we're having a fit about it today. Add the parent. So here we go. So you see child items there. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to find the child items table. So it's PAGC assets. Bear in mind, just as a secondary point as well to this, these tables were created with the new function overview of kind of table creation using Copilot. The names are slightly off. You might want to keep an eye out that if you're using that kind of function. So I've just added the child items as active assets. And then I'm going to say, hey, this is based upon asset supplier. And I'm going to make this also editable. And I'll make the child entries editable. Save it, publish it, Just close down. And there we go. So this is now in the Power Apps Grid Control on the main page. And hey, I can come in here and I can edit my entries from in here. Change the name, but because I disabled the editing of child items, it's not going to work. Yeah, that is the Power Apps Grid Control. And those watching the recording, if you have any questions, feel free to either drop them in our Discord channel, which is the Power Apps Challenge, or send either myself a message or a YouTube comment. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.